So we are continuing with the study of the Old Testament prophets, specifically what is called the later prophets. And we're going to be studying 3 prophets, and they're relatively short books, so we're going to try to fit them into one morning of discussion. So with that, I'll just pray before we get started. Father, I just pray again for this time in studying your prophets and what the prophets had to say. And Father, just help us understand what it means by what they said. And Father, help us to understand what that means for us in the future, as well as what it meant for them back in their day. And Father, help us all understand how all this fits together in your big plan for mankind over the centuries. In Jesus' name, amen. So here we are again in the later prophets, and we're starting out with the first prophet of Nahum. And the historical setting for this book and the date for the book is around 663 to 612 BC. So the book of Nahum is a prophecy against Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Nineveh was a major city in the ancient Mesopotamia, located on the Tigris River near the modern-day city of Mosul, Iraq. So it's basically in the Iraq area now that we know as Iraq. So about 150 years before, in 760 BC, Jonah prophesied to Nineveh, and it repented, and God had compassion on them and spared them from judgment. So this has to do with judgment on the city of Nineveh as part of Assyria. But remember when Vincent taught on Jonah before, that God spared them back in that time. But now there's this lag of time when they actually are going to be judged. But Nineveh slipped back into her former brutal, godless ways and once again faced the judgment of God. Nineveh is first mentioned when Nimrod, the son of Cush, who actually built Nineveh. And then we have all of these kings here. So we have Tiglath the third invaded Israel during the reign of Nahum, and in 731 BC, King Ahaz of Judah became a vassal of this king Tiglath. And Shalmaneser, these are all Assyrian kings, defeated the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, so this was before this book. And in 701, Sennacherib invaded the southern kingdom of Judah, conquering cities and threatened Jerusalem during Hezekiah's reign. So you have the northern kingdom of Israel that was taken away in 722 BC by the armies and conquered. And then you have this lag of time, and then there's this book of Nahum. So the Lord afflicted rebellious Judah by the army of Assyria, which resulted in the capture of King Manasseh because of his evil. Then Ashurbanipal, these names, we're going to have a test on these later on, if you can pronounce them, okay? And defeated Noamon, which is another name for Thebes of Egypt. Nahum 3:8 is where that's located. It talks about that. And that was done in 663 BC. And the Babylonians and Medes had an alliance that brought the siege and defeat of Nineveh in 612 BC. So that's a key date for this book, this 612. The theme of the book, the major theme is the judgment of God on his adversaries and enemies. God judges those who sin against him, and his prophecies are true and will be fulfilled. But even as Judah watched the fulfillment of this judgment of Nineveh, the Lord's warnings through Nineveh's prophecy did not bring them to repentance, but God would restore them. So here we have the first chart here, the one similar chart that I had from before, and you'll see at the bottom, across the bottom, about the center of those lavender-colored prophets is where these prophets are located. You see they're before the exile, and they're also after the northern kingdom was divided. If you look straight up above, you see the 722 BC captivity of the northern kingdom. And so we're in that little white space next to the 722, which basically means the northern kingdom is gone out of the picture. Those 10 tribes are gone, and there's only the 2 tribes left in the southern kingdom. So moving on. The introduction is the oracle of Nineveh, the vision of Nahum. So Nahum's prophecy is concerning Nineveh, like we said, and is received by Nahum through a vision, as many other prophets saw prophetic visions. So this is pretty normal how he received this information. It basically just says he saw, and doesn't use the word vision, but later on it does use the word vision, pointing back to these first verses. So in the second part, there's actually a psalm that speaks of God's vengeance, wrath, and anger. So Nahum's vision begins by describing the character of God, highlighting his vengeance, wrath, anger, and indignation. Vengeance and wrath belong to the Lord, and punishment of his enemies, the guilty. The Lord is good, a stronghold in trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. So a lot of times people say, well, God's a loving God, and a loving God wouldn't do this, and a loving God wouldn't do that, and a loving God wouldn't do this, but he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. That's a very important principle to understand. God's power is seen through all of creation, which trembles and quakes before his presence, and the Lord will make a complete end of its sight. Here we're talking about Nineveh, so he'll make a complete end of Nineveh. And remember, Nineveh is this gigantic city with thousands and thousands of people, with big walls and armies and great wealth and everything that a big city would normally have. Be very, very prosperous and have all these people and goods traded, and it's just a huge, huge place. Then moving on, in part 3, the Lord's coming judgment on Nineveh and the deliverance of Judah. So whatever Nineveh devises, the Lord will put an end to it. There's nothing that this city or nation can devise, imagine, or plan against the Lord, because the Lord will terminate their plan and devastate their city. Though they have great strength and are many, the Lord will cut them off and they will pass away. Though the Lord afflicted Judah, he will break the yoke from Nineveh's bondage upon them. The Lord will cut off and prepare a grave for the contemptible Nineveh. All these are in these verses here that are labeled there. So, and then it says, proclaim good news of peace, Judah, for never again will the wicked one pass through you. So the Lord not only does judgment on these different nations at different times, but remember, he says it ahead of time. It's prophecy. So not only does he say it ahead of time, he warns them ahead of time. He says, okay, the Lord reveals to the prophet, this thing is going to happen. And then the prophet is to tell the people, this thing is going to happen in the future. Then that event takes place just like the prophecy said, because it must take place, because whatever God prophesies, it must come to pass. Part 4, the Lord's coming judgment on Nineveh by Babylon. So the one who scatters, this is probably referring to Cyaxares the Mede, and Nabopolassar the Babylonian is against you, Nineveh. For the Lord will restore Jacob, Israel, through the Assyrians, though the Assyrians have devastated and plundered her. So mighty men, warriors with chariots of Babylon, march against Nineveh like torches. The palace, probably the temple of Ishtar, is destroyed, fixed, and stripped. Nineveh is fleeing and is plundered by her wealth of the people of Nineveh. Nineveh is a desolation and a waste in anguish and pale. And where are the lions of Nineveh? So when they talk about lions, they're not necessarily talking about beasts. They're just talking about those powerful men of Nineveh that in the past are always thought about as being lions because of their how fearless they were. So the Lord against Nineveh, he will burn you and kill you with sword and cut you off by Babylon. So here the prophet's telling ahead of time what's going to happen. Then part 5, woe to Nineveh, her plunder by Babylon never departs. So you start having this woes mentioned. Woe to Nineveh, full of lives and pillage. The warriors of Assyria, their horses, swords, and spears bring countless dead bodies. Nineveh's judgment is because of her harlotry and sorcery. So here there's given the reason for the judgment. It isn't just, we're judging you. It's, we're judging you because of all of these things. The Lord through Babylon is against you, Nineveh. You will be disgraced and devastated. So Nineveh, by the Tigris River, are you no better than Nahum, which is another name for thieves of Egypt, by the Nile River, sacked previously by the Assyrians? So here it's talking about what happened before. Remember what happened in Egypt? Guess what? Now it's going to happen to you now in Babylon. Thebes then, like Nineveh, turned to her vassal territories for support, but to no avail. She went into exile and captivity, and her children dashed, and her men were bound. So moving on. Nineveh's judgment of fire and sword consumes them like locusts do. So, like drunk persons, the Ninevites would have no sense and direction under attack, frantically seeking to hide. Also, they literally became drunk with intoxicants with the inability to defend themselves. Her fortifications would fall, her gates open to her enemies, and fire will consume her, and the sword will cut her down. These of fire and sword will consume Nineveh like the locusts do. As the locust consumes everything, so everything in Nineveh will be consumed. So it's comparing this event to the locusts. I don't think any locusts were involved in this event, but it's saying just like locusts devour everything and destroy everything in their path, so Babylon will be that way. It'll destroy everything in their path as they come into Nineveh. So when Nineveh was the proud capital of a vast empire and her merchants brought enormous wealth to the city, Nineveh's merchants and traders will do the city no good. The enemy, like locusts, will devour all that there is in Nineveh through plundering, slaughter, and destruction. Nineveh's guardsmen and marshals are like locusts that flee to places unknown. So Nineveh's, Assyria's, shepherds, nobles are all sleeping, lying down, or complacent. Nineveh's people are scattered. So everybody in the city's like, whatever, we're so powerful, no one's going to attack us, hey, we've been in control for hundreds of years, everything's fine, just take a nap, it doesn't really matter, but they're still scattered. So there's no relief for Nineveh, it's incurable, for all who hear of you will clap, for all your evil has passed continually on them. So Nineveh, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was destroyed in 612 BC, like we said, and by the coalition of forces, including Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians. The siege lasted several months, and the city was eventually sacked and burned, marking the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Excuse me. So the Babylonians now take over from the Assyrians. So the Assyrians were like the world, they're the most powerful nation in the world. And then the Babylonians come in and destroy them, and now the Babylonians are the most powerful nation in the whole world, right? And when we get to Daniel, we'll be talking a lot about that, because there's all those four nations that Daniel talks about in his prophecy, and these are two of those four nations. So here we have a little picture there on the page to kind of show you what it was like at that time when they were all attacked and Nineveh was destroyed. So moving on, we're going to go to the next book. The next book is Habakkuk. And so now we're going to see what we can learn from him. So the date of the book was about 608 to 598 BC, and he prophesied during the beginning of Babylon's world rulership under Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar. You remember Nebuchadnezzar is the one that was during the time of Daniel, but here again affects this prophecy. Habakkuk was a contemporary of Jeremiah, of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zephaniah. So even if you were to look on the chart and look at those dates, you could see all contemporary just means at the same time, and they were prophesying or overlapping the same time as him. The mention of the Chaldeans suggests a date after the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 612 and after Nebuchadnezzar commenced his military march through Nineveh, Haran, and the overlapping his march on Cheramish in 605, and this on his way to Jerusalem. So when the Babylonians had the big war, what typically when these big nations come in, they come in and they battle this city and they win it, and then they go to the next city and they overcome that city, and they just kind of work their way along and start conquering all of these cities because they want control and work their way across the nations. Now, the theme of the book, when violence and corruption abound and evil appears to rule, the faithful will be tempted to wonder whether God really cares or is really in control, right? We could say that today, right? We could say that. All the crazy stuff going on in the world now, is God really in control? So Habakkuk's dialogue helps us to understand that God does not despise such questions when they are carried to him in prayer and from an honest heart. His prophecy reaffirms that God is in control of history and that his dealings are always just and right. Believers must be willing to accept God's answers and delight in his will, even if those are completely foreign to their own thinking. So even though I may think, that doesn't seem right. God wouldn't do that. You have to understand that God's always just, and He's always right, and He always does the right thing because He's God and He knows the end from the beginning. He knows what's going to happen ahead of time. He sees the big picture, and we see the small picture. So we can't see the whole plan of God over centuries and centuries and thousands of years, but He does. So He's the one that decides what's right. Believers must be willing to accept God's answers and delight in His will, even if those are completely foreign to their own thinking. God does see and care deeply about what happens on earth. Although people may not perceive it, God's sovereign hand is at work. He will ultimately bring matters to a proper and just conclusion. Because God has a plan and purpose that will be established, which it talks about in Isaiah 46. God is not reactionary. He doesn't go, oh no, what are we going to do now? And then He goes and reacts. No, God plans ahead of time. He has a purpose ahead of time. It's very important to understand that principle. In the introduction, the oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. So a burden, sometimes when it has the word oracle, it's a lot of times translated burden. A burden is a weighty, heavy oracle of judgment and is often used by prophets to announce God's wrath against sin. The book is about what the prophet saw, later called a vision. God's message in Habakkuk took the form of a vision that revealed what God was about to do. And then moving to part 2, he starts questioning God concerning Judah's sin. So he's focusing now on Judah, which is his people, which is the southern kingdom. Remember, the 2 tribes that are left. Okay? The book opens with a dialogue between Habakkuk and the Lord in 2 sections. Each is a complaint by the prophet, followed by the Lord's answer or response. His first complaint, starting in verse 2, he complains, how long will he call for help from the Lord concerning corrupted Judah? And the Lord does not hear him or save them. For they are full of iniquity, wickedness, lawlessness, no justice, and is perverted, and wonders how long the Lord will tolerate such evil. So he's focusing on Judah here, God's people, the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes, and he sees how bad and sinful Judah, God's people, are. And he goes, Lord, what's going on? How come you're allowing all this? How come you're not doing anything? Then, following down that next paragraph, the Lord responds to Habakkuk's complaint. So God's response to him was clear. He was to look to the nations because the Lord was going to do something unbelievable. The Lord is raising up the Chaldeans, meaning the Babylonians, a fierce and dreaded and violent people, to deal with the apostasy and wickedness and injustice of his people Judah. Moses warned Israel way back in Deuteronomy 28 that they would be cursed if they disobeyed God until they were destroyed. Babylon destroying Jerusalem is described in 2 Chronicles and Jeremiah there in those verses. And the whole land will be a desolation and a horror and serve Babylon for 70 years. That's the 70-year exile, right? So the Lord answers his question by saying, hey, I am doing something. I'm going to bring the nations against you, specifically the nation of Babylon. So moving on, that verse helps us to understand this, how the Lord thinks and understands evil in the world. In Jeremiah 30:11, it says, I am with you, declares the Lord, to save you. For I will destroy completely all the nations where I have scattered you. Only I will not destroy you completely, but I will chasten you justly and will by no means leave you unpunished. So do you see how that works? God's going to save Israel. He's not going to destroy them, but he's going to punish them by using these nations to punish Judah. And then, when he does that, he's not unjust in doing it. God can do whatever he wants. And he will by no means leave Israel unpunished. So they had to go through punishment because he told them ahead of time through Moses. When Moses was 120 years old, right before he died, he told them all these things that were going to happen. So the second complaint. So Habakkuk now complains to the Lord again. He's going, well, I have this another thing I want to complain about. He raised questions regarding God's justice in ordering the wicked and cruel Babylonians to be God's instruments for judging wicked Judah. His questions, it's actually in four parts, this one question. Why appoint wicked Babylon to judge and correct wicked Judah? Why do that, Lord? Your eyes are too pure to reprove evil and cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on the treacherous? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up the righteous? Why permit the Babylonians to deal so ruthlessly with mankind as a fish? He compares them to a fish. Remember with fish, a lot of times, you catch the fish and you immediately destroy it or get rid of it, and they just like easy come, easy go kind of thing. And then Habakkuk will keep watch, for the Lord will again speak to him so he can reply. So Habakkuk says, okay, I'm asking these questions, but I'm going to keep watch, meaning I'm going to continue on with what I'm doing and wait to see when the Lord will talk to him. So here the Lord responds to this complaint. He is told to record the vision and inscribe it on tablets that the one who reads it may run. So he basically says, write it down so you can tell other people and you can remember it and get it right. Because the vision is for the appointed time, it hastens towards the goal and it will not fail. Though the vision tarries, meaning it doesn't happen immediately, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. It's going to happen. The proud one, his soul is not right, but the righteous will live by his faith. Remember what faith is. It's trusting what you don't see ahead of time. The haughty man, wine betrays him. His appetite, like Sheol, is never satisfied. He is never satisfied in the pursuit of people to conquer. Woe to those who commit injustices. Woe for the greedy. Woe for him who gets evil gain. Woe for him who builds with bloodshed and violence. The Lord sees people or nations toil for fire for nothing. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. So even this, after this really negative part, he fills that in, that the Lord's knowledge fills the world. Woe to him who uses drink for lustful immorality. You have your fill of shame. For violence will overwhelm you, for your violence towards others. Woe for him who trusts in idols of wood, stone, and gold. But in contrast, the Lord is in his holy temple. So there's all this immorality and sin and crazy stuff going on in the world, but guess what? The Lord is in his temple in heaven, and he is ruling. So the contrast is first representative of mankind. So the proud, the haughty, the unjust, the greedy, the evil gainers, the violent, those who toil for nothing, the drinkers, the immoral, who trust in their idols. It talks about those in those verses. And then the attention shifts to the Lord in the final verse 20. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, the living Lord, the eternal self-existent one, the Holy One, the sovereign one who rules the universe from his holy temple in heaven. Then finally, this prayer of Habakkuk based on God's report. So now he prays in worship to the Lord in verse 1. He asks the Lord to revive his works in his wrath, remember mercy in verse 2. He exalts the Lord's splendor, praise, radiance, power, and surveying the earth. He praises the Lord's purposes in his rage, anger, wrath, indignation towards the nations. Yeah, in that previous one where the Lord's surveying the earth, there's even other passages like in Zephaniah that talk about the Lord sends out his angels to go over all the earth and kind of report back. So there's this ongoing thing that the Lord does somehow, and it doesn't give you a lot of detail, about the Lord surveying the earth to make sure he understands all that's going on, and then he understands and knows what's going to happen and how to react and when to react, and he has even the angels involved in that. So at the bottom, inwardly, he must wait quietly for the day of distress for arising invaders. If all fails, he will exalt the Lord and rejoice in the God of his salvation. He prays, "The Lord is my strength. He makes me walk in high places." So Habakkuk was a really faithful guy, and he wanted to obey the Lord, and he was a man of God, and God knew he was, and God revealed these things to him because of that. Finally, the third book. Now we're going to go into the third book. This one's really interesting. This is probably my favorite of the three as far as finding out events, okay? So, the date of the book is approximately 640 to 630 BC. Zephaniah's ministry was during the reign of King Josiah in Judah, more specifically 640 to 630 BC. He was probably the distant relative of Josiah and a contemporary of Jeremiah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. So again, if you look up, he's a contemporary of those at the bottom of the page there. He tells about the events that took place in Jerusalem in the late 7th century, and Josiah was king. The northern kingdom of Israel had been destroyed and nearly a century earlier by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom of Judah had suffered under the wicked rules of Manasseh, the king of the lower southern kingdom, and Ammon, also a king there, and the evils of their reigns had made doom appear certain. But the godly King Josiah led an important revival that affected all Judah. This revival, though short-lived, delayed God's judgment, meaning the invasion of Babylon. The theme of the book is the day of the Lord. The phrase day of the Lord, also used by the prophet Joel, and refers to a period characterized by gloom, darkness, judgment, but followed by prosperity, restoration, and blessing. Okay? So in the introduction, the word of the Lord came to Zephaniah is a typical phrase introduced in prophetic books. So a lot of the books start out with this kind of phrase. The Lord's judgment upon the whole earth. So now, just in this little section, he's going to focus on judgment on the whole earth, looking ahead hundreds, if not thousands of years ahead. This judgment includes the Lord's removing all man, beast, birds, and fish from the earth. All man and beast highlights the totality of destruction as in the creation account. God, the creator of everything, will destroy everything due to the sin of mankind, creation's representative. So here, he begins to describe the often mentioned day of the Lord. Day of the Lord is that far future time of judgment when God will pour out his wrath on all earth. So a number of times in this book, it talks about all earth and not a specific city like Nineveh. And it's in the distant future. Then in the next little section here, starting in verse 4, he described the day of the Lord in terms of the wrath of God against sin and rebellion of his own people, Judah and Jerusalem. So he switches from all the earth to specifically Judah and Jerusalem. Because of their Baal worship, idolatrous priests, and bowing to angels, those who worship the Lord and false gods, and those who have turned from and not turned to the Lord. The day of the Lord, that near future time of judgment when God will pour out his wrath on Judah and Jerusalem, and when Judah's wicked people would be destroyed by Babylon invasion of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So when you say something's near, but he's going, well, near, that's really close by, right? Well, near is another way to say near is imminent. The imminent judgment of God is said to be soon, quickly, near, and emphasizing the Lord's judgment is certain, but its specific timing or date is unknown. Okay? So that is kind of often brought up in prophecy because it's like the rapture is talked about being imminent. It's going to happen at any time. The second coming is going to be imminent. It's going to happen at any time. It's pending. We don't know when it's going to be, but it's going to happen. The day of the Lord is near is the day of the Lord's sacrifice. The day of the Lord is near. The Lord is prepared to sacrifice and set apart his guests. The Lord will punish princes, kings' sons, and those who treat the temple with violence and deceit. And that day there will be crying and wailing in Jerusalem. At that time the Lord will search Jerusalem for complacent in spirit men. So you know who those are. They're like, oh yeah, I believe in God, yeah, whatever, but they really don't in their heart believe it and practice it. The day of the Lord is that near future time of judgment when God judges Judah and Jerusalem in 586 BC. So it is just not too many years in the future when this happens. So moving on. The day of the Lord is near and coming very quickly on all earth. So now we're switching back to all earth again. Remember, it was all earth, then just Jerusalem. Now we're back to all earth again. Verse 14. The day of the Lord is near and coming quickly when warriors cry out. Is a day of wrath, trouble, distress, destruction, desolation, darkness, gloom. The day of the Lord's wrath brings distress on men of sin, as in their blood and flesh. So God is going to punish sinful men in the far future on all the earth. Okay? Nothing will be able to deliver them. All earth will be devoured. The Lord will make a complete and terrifying end of all inhabitants of the earth. Is that more specific or what? That's really specific. The day of the Lord, that far future time of judgment, when God will pour out his wrath on all the earth. Just like in Revelation chapters 6 through 19. In the distant future. So here we have Habakkuk way, way back before Christ, 600 years before Christ, talking about what's going to happen a couple thousand years after Christ or more. So here again is that description of near as in imminent. The imminent judgment of God is said to be as soon, quickly, and near. And I also added here, it is pending and could happen at any time. Emphasizing the Lord's judgment is certain, but a specific timing and date is unknown. So before the day of the Lord's anger comes, seek the Lord. So here's a warning. That could apply to us today. Before the Lord comes and does and destroys all earth and every inhabitant on the earth, every sinful man on earth, seek the Lord. So way back in his time, he's telling Israel to do that, and that applies to us in our time. Here God gives warning. He warns people ahead of time, which is often that the prophets do. Gather yourselves before the decree takes effect, before the Lord's anger comes. Seek the Lord in righteousness, you humble, to hide from the Lord's anger. Then it switches to the Lord's judgment upon the surrounding nations. Here the Lord describes the destruction of Gentile nations around Judah, the surrounding nations, but also comments on the remnant of God's people the Lord will restore. So in the middle of saying he's going to judge the nations, he had these little side notes about, oh, by the way, I'm going to restore Israel. Then he talks about destroying the nation. He says, oh, by the way, I'm going to restore Israel. Judgment against Philistia or Canaan and those cities listed. Then it says the remnant of Judah the Lord will care for and restore in verse 6 and 7. Then he says the judgment against these other two tribes, Moab and Ammon. Moab will be like Sodom and Ammon like Gomorrah, desolate. And then he goes back to the remnant of God's people will plunder and inherit those places. Then the judgment against these cities, Ethiopia, and will be slain by the Lord's sword. Judgment against Assyria. Then the Lord will restore Assyria and make Nineveh desolate and parched. Okay. So he tells ahead of time what's going to happen. And God warns his people it's going to happen. He tells them, be sure your heart is right. Be sure you repent and know the Lord, because someday the Lord will restore you. And then it moves to God's judgment and woe to Jerusalem, a rebellious city. So now it switches from the nations back to Jerusalem. The Lord now gives the reasons for Jerusalem's destruction. They did not heed the Lord's voice or instruction or trust or draw near to the Lord. So remember, the Lord just doesn't haphazardly say, I'm going to destroy somebody. He gives the reason. Jerusalem's princes and judges are corrupt. The prophets and priests are profane the sanctuary and the law. So basically, they're doing almost everything wrong. Everything that Moses told them to do, they were not doing. But the Lord is righteous and just and will not and not unjust concerning Jerusalem. The Lord has cut off the nations, laid waste their cities. The Lord said, surely Jerusalem would revere him, but they instead were corrupt. So not only were the 10 northern tribes corrupt, and the Lord sent judgment on them, the southern 2 tribes were corrupt, and the Lord sent judgment on them. Now it switches back to judgment on the whole earth again. It keeps switching back and forth. The Lord will gather the nations and assemble the kingdoms. The Lord will pour out his indignation and anger. All the earth will be devoured by the Lord's fire. All the earth will be devoured by fire. So remember, with Noah, the whole earth was destroyed by water. And in the future, the whole earth will be destroyed by fire. In the final verse of the judgment section, the prophet returns to the judgment of all earth. He once again foretells that God will judge all of the earth. At the end of the future tribulation judgment, the Lord will gather the nations and kingdoms against Jerusalem, which it talks about in Zechariah when we get there. For the great day of God, meaning Armageddon, this is the time of Jacob's distress, but Jacob will be saved from it. Remember, we read all those verses about them being restored. The Lord will restore Israel and Judah and bring them back to the land, and they will possess it, and they will serve the Lord, and David will be their king. So if you read Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 3 through 9, that's what it basically says. Remember? Jerusalem and Israel did great wrong and great sin. And God will greatly punish them for a long period of time. But then he will restore them and give them land and bring them back. So moving on, part 3. The Lord's conversion of the nations and the restoration of Israel. So the Lord's conversion of the nations to call on and serve him. Following the day of the Lord would come a time when the nations would be cleansed, and would once again worship the Lord. Then will I purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. So here it switches to unbelievers in the end times, and it doesn't give us all tons of detail, but somehow the nations, the common people that aren't of Israel, will be called by God and cleaned up by God. And this will be in the future millennial kingdom. In that day, there will be a restoration of Israel. So, what follows is the depiction of a restored Israel in the future Messianic kingdom. Having purged Israel during the tribulation, the Lord will love and rejoice over Israel. Now remember, Israel doesn't deserve it. They don't deserve to be restored. But they will be, because it says over and over and over and over again by the prophets that that's going to be the case. And even Paul in Romans 11, 25 and 26, he says all Israel be saved after the second coming, or at the second coming. Okay? The remnant of Israel in the Messianic kingdom. In that day, Israel will feel no shame because of her rebellion. The Lord will remove Israel's proud. Israel will never be haughty on my holy mountain. He's talking about Mount Zion in Jerusalem. The Lord will leave lowly and humble people to take refuge in the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong. They will do no wrong. They will not lie or be deceitful. The Lord will remove Israel's shame and rebellion and leave them lowly and humble, and they will not do wrong or lie or be deceitful, but will take refuge in the Lord. So how can that be? Well, like Ezekiel chapter 36 says about the new covenant, I will give them a new heart, a new spirit, and put the Holy Spirit in them, and they will seek the Lord and love the Lord with all their heart, mind, and soul. They will do that because the Lord, through his new covenant at that time, will do that. Then it talks about, rejoice, Israel of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away his judgments against you, cleared your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You, Israel, will fear no more. Then King Messiah, the Lord, will be ruling in Israel's midst. It says that twice in the book. On Mount Zion in Jerusalem. So the Lord will be with Israel. So if you remember in the book of Ezekiel that the Lord leaves the temple, he hovers and goes out the east gate. But at the second coming, the Lord comes back through the east gate and comes back to the temple in Jerusalem. Key verses here. I did these 3 verses here to help us understand that. Isaiah chapter 2. Now it will come about in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of mountains, and it will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we will walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this is one of the best pictures of what the millennial kingdom is going to be like. The Lord's in Jerusalem on Mount Zion in his temple, and the people will all go there, and they'll learn from him and understand from him. And it's for all this time period, this future kingdom is how it's going to be like. Also in Isaiah chapter 4 says, in that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be pride and adornment of the survivors of Israel. It will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who's recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst, by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning, because it kind of goes on from there, but it's that basic idea. So the Lord is burning, purging, getting rid of all the sinful people, and there only be godly people at that time. Why? Because of the new covenant. Because the new covenant, that's what the new covenant does. It gives you a new heart so you don't sin like you did before. Finally, in Luke 1:32, I think this is such a great verse to kind of understand the big picture. He will be great and be called the Son of the Most High. And remember, this was said to Mary. It's said to Mary before Jesus was born. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. So, if someone says, how long will the Lord reign over Israel or Jacob? You say forever, and his kingdom will have no end. Oh. So the Lord's kingdom will have no end. It'll go on and on and on. Finally, moving to the last page. In that day, Jerusalem, Zion, do not be afraid, the Lord is in your midst. So here's that phrase, in your midst again. The Lord will exalt, love, and rejoice over you with joy. The Lord will gather grievers of the feast. At that time, the Lord will deal with Israel's oppressors. He'll take care of all the problems. The Lord will save the lame and the outcast and turn their shame to praise in, here's the phrase, in all earth. So everywhere. When people say, well, how come the Lord doesn't come now and get rid of all the problems in the earth? He is. He promised. He will. He said many times, not only by this prophet, by other prophets. At that time, the Lord will gather Israel and restore her fortunes among all earth. At that time, the Lord will bring you, Israel, in and gather you. So, Israel's dispersed over all the earth, right? There was dispersed when they were judged by Babylon, and then they somewhat gathered together. And then they're dispersed after the cross. Remember when the Romans come in and destroy Israel in 70 A.D., and it even says, if you look in the history, that they were hauled away in ships all over the world. And people say, well, yeah, but now Israel's a nation now, and they're all gathered back together. And I'm like, well, sorta. I mean, that's part of it, the gathering. But the other part of that gathering, remember, has to be the Lord's in his temple in Jerusalem. Is the Lord in his temple in Jerusalem now? No, don't think so, because there's no temple, and there's no Lord, and there's no believers, right? So there is somewhat of a fulfillment in the sense that Israel's back in their land, but they got tons of stuff to happen. And then remember, if they even are back in the land, they got to be loving the Lord, and all evil is purged away. Is that happening in Israel now? Not yet. Not yet. Will it happen? Guaranteed. Why can I say that? Because that's what the prophet said, that was revealed to them by the Lord. At that time, the Lord will give you, Israel, renown and praise among all the earth. So here Israel will be exalted. They'll be renowned and praise. Everybody's going, whoa, that's Israel. Whoa. When I restore your fortunes, says the Lord. So at that time, the Lord will restore the fortunes of Israel. At that time, he will restore them. So what does that mean? Well, it's all through the Old Testament, all through the prophets. There's a lot of detail. The Lord will restore them. It even says in Ezekiel 36 that it'll be better than the Garden of Eden. That's pretty good. Right? There's going to be the Lord there to judge and take care of things in the temple. It'll be a wonderful time for Israel. God's blessing and restoration of Israel in the future. So the closing verses of Zephaniah summarize the promises of God of blessing Israel in the future, including the regathering of Israel to the promised land. So when is the first time that it's mentioned the promised land, right? Way back in Genesis chapter 12, as part of the Abrahamic covenant, the Lord says to Abraham, before he's just getting started. He's age 75, and he's just getting started. And the Lord said, I will give you this land, remember? And then in Genesis 15, the Lord tells Abraham that you will inherit the land from the Euphrates to the Nile River, all of that land, okay? And when we studied Ezekiel, we briefly touched on how that land's going to be proportioned out to the tribes. I even gave you a little map that showed you that they would get about this area and this area and this area, and how that all plays out. And Israel will be honored and praised by the nations, and the restoration of Israel's good fortunes will be in being returned to the land. So in the millennium, the promise to Israel's ultimate possession of her land, and you can look on all those verses, and it talks about that. And the coming of Christ and her Messiah and King will result in restoration of the Davidic kingdom. fulfilling the promises to David. So, just touching on that for a second is the Davidic covenant. Remember, the Davidic covenant to David when he was still alive said there will always be a king on the throne. And then when you jump to Matthew chapter 1, what's the first thing they do? They give you the genealogy that links Christ to David, right? And then what we read here a couple minutes ago in Luke chapter 1, verses 32 and 33, it talks about that the Lord is the Son of David that will rule on the throne in Jerusalem. Okay? So the Davidic covenant, that's what it promises. And if you look in those verses there and to read them, it talks about that in great detail if you want to know more about it. So what the Lord has promised will be done. It will come to pass. He will do it. These promises have their ultimate fulfillment in the Messianic kingdom. So when we talk about the kingdom, it talks about the future kingdom. And sometimes it calls it the future kingdom. Sometimes it calls it Davidic kingdom. Sometimes it's called the Messianic kingdom. Sometimes it's called the millennial kingdom. But it's all that kingdom, okay? So the Lord comes in Revelation 19. Remember, he comes on the white horse and destroys all the nations that come up against him. And then Satan, it says, he's going to be bound for 1,000 years. Remember, it talks about 1,000 years 6 times in Revelation chapter 20. So during that 1,000-year period, most of these things are going to happen that are mentioned in this book. Christ will be in Jerusalem, in his temple, on Mount Zion, and people will stream into it. Israel will be all restored. And then I call this period of time, this kingdom, is kind of a transition time, right? It's kind of a transition time. Because it's not the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. There'll still be people born. They'll live really long lives, like it says in Isaiah 65, but they will still die. And remember, at the end of the 1,000-year period, what happens? Satan is released from being bound for 1,000 years. He gathers all the armies. He brings them up against Jerusalem. Christ destroys them. There's not even hardly a battle. It's just he takes them out, right? He completely takes them out. And immediately after that is what they call the white throne judgment. And all those unbelievers are gathered, and it says they open the books and they judge all the people, unbelievers only, by the deeds that are written in those books. And they're all thrown in the lake of fire at that time. It tells that all ahead of time. So remember, one of the main themes of the prophets in the Old Testament is sin, judgment, and restoration. Right? Mostly focusing on Israel. Israel sins. It's detailed in great detail. How many times, how much. It describes their sin all through the prophets. God tells them ahead of time they're going to be judged. He tells them over and over and over again they're going to be judged. He warns them, he warns them, he warns them, he warns them. And then almost every time after he warns them, after they're judged, he goes, "Oh, but in the last days I will restore you." Oh, I'll restore you. But they don't deserve it. They don't deserve to be restored. But we don't deserve to be restored either, do we? We don't deserve to have our sins forgiven, do we? That's what grace is, right? Undeserved favor of God towards you. Remember that. We don't deserve it. With that, I can end. Is there any questions before I end? I got a couple minutes. Any thoughts or questions? Maybe just said, oh, I didn't understand that part, or maybe even a praise to say, oh man, that's cool that the Lord's going to do this or that, and understanding all that. Any thoughts or ideas? Yeah.
It's several questions about the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
To start with, it seems like there's the word, or the phrase is always used, day of judgment of the Lord, but there are multiple days of the Lord, local days of the Lord, days of judgment. And then there's the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
The final one. One day is the final judgment with the new heaven and new earth, the great white throne judgment.
Uh-huh.
Is that all part of one day of the Lord that includes the millennium, or is that two separate big days? Go back even further, it seems like, at least in the English translation, it's always called the day of the Lord with a definite article, even though it could refer to one of the small
Yeah.
days. Is that in the original? Is it always a definite article?
Yeah. The question is the day of the Lord sometimes is used for a specific event in a specific time, and other times the day of the Lord kind of covers a period of time. And it may even, like what the question was, for those who didn't hear the question, that the Lord sometimes does things at a specific time, and then there's a lag of time and he does something else. So the only way I can answer that is that the Lord does have specific times when specific events will take place. For example, before or at the second coming, the Lord, that's the day of the Lord, the Lord comes and destroys everything, and then there's a lag of 1,000 years, and then when Satan's released, he destroys again, so there's a second time. So in general, there's always going to be a day of the Lord's judgment, but it's going to be in the specific times and specific areas of prophecy, and you kind of have to look to see what the context is. Now, as far as the definite article, I guess I don't have a good answer for that. I guess you'd have to look in the context and first see if "thes" in the actual language of the Hebrew or the Greek, you first double check that, because sometimes it's added so it makes a sentence that sounds right in the particular verse. So as far as the article "the," I don't have a really good answer for that. I'd have to look that up myself. But the day of the Lord is the time when the Lord comes in judgment and destruction, but, and everything I read, it also includes the time of restoration. And you're like, well, what is it? Is it judgment or is it restoration? Well, my understanding is it's both. It's a time primarily of judgment and destruction, but it also includes a time of restoration that follows. So with that, I'll have to end with prayer. So, Father,